The night sky over Boston hung heavy with rain clouds, but the city refused to sleep. Neon signs buzzed like restless insects, throwing streaks of color across wet pavement. Amid the rush of taxis and the glow of glass towers, one building seemed caught in another time. The Moonlight Diner, its chrome dulled by decades, its neon flickering stubbornly against the modern skyline. Inside, the world smelled of bacon grease, burnt toast, and the faint bitterness of old coffee. The red vinyl booths were cracked like dry riverbeds, their stuffing peeking through the seams. The Formica counters bore the scars of generations of elbows and coffee cups. To the casual eye, it was just another greasy spoon clinging to survival in a city that had long since outgrown it. Behind the counter, Clara Dawson moved with a practiced rhythm. At 27, she carried herself with the weariness of someone twice her age. Her pale blue uniform hung loose on her frame, the collar slightly frayed, the apron tied tight to hold it all together. She wiped down tables, refilled chipped mugs, and balanced heavy plates with the kind of efficiency that only came from repetition. The smell of fried bacon clung to her hair. Coffee stains marked her fingers, and the arch of her back bore the silent testimony of too many hours on her feet. To the handful of customers scattered around the diner, she was invisible, a shadow that brought pie and poured refills, especially to the three men in the corner booth. They wore sharp suits that looked fresh off Newbury Street, tailored within an inch of perfection. Their voices carried over the clatter of silverware, loud, arrogant, and dismissive. To them, Clara was nothing more than background noise, the waitress in the faded apron, a ghost in a place long past its prime. But Clara had not always been invisible. Not long ago, she had walked the bright halls of MIT, chalk dust on her fingers and equations flowing from her mind like poetry. She had stood at the threshold of discovery, her work on the cutting edge of theoretical physics. Professors whispered about her potential, colleagues envied the brilliance of her ideas. She was young, fearless, and certain the future held galaxies of possibility. Then came Ethan, her younger brother, just 15 when the doctors gave their verdict, a rare genetic disorder, merciless in its progression. Insurance would not cover the experimental treatments. The price of hope looked more like a telephone number than a bill. And so Clara had traded whiteboards for bus tubs, theories of the cosmos for crumpled dollar tips tucked into her apron pocket. Every refill she poured, every greasy plate she carried was for him. Ethan was the reason she endured the neon buzzing overhead and the endless orders shouted from the kitchen, the casual cruelty of strangers who never looked past the name tag pinned crookedly to her chest. Tonight was no different, or so she thought. The Moonlight Diner hummed with its usual rhythm, the jukebox silent in the corner, the rain outside turning the windows into impressionist paintings of the city beyond. Clara worked her shift with quiet resolve, her mind wandering, as it often did, to the elegant equations she once drew across blackboards. She could still see them in her mind, flowing like constellations, mocking her from a life she had been forced to abandon. And then, in the far corner booth, an old man turned a page of his newspaper. His tweed jacket was worn, the elbows patched, his hair silver and neatly combed. He looked like a retired professor, perhaps a librarian, someone who belonged to the diner's quieter corners. He sipped his tea slowly, his eyes hidden behind a pair of simple reading glasses, but he was watching. Watching Clara with an intensity that no one else in the room noticed. His gaze lingered not on the clatter of plates or the three men boasting in the corner, but on the tired young woman in the apron, the one who moved with the grace of someone carrying a secret far heavier than the tray in her hands. Clara Dawson thought it was just another night. She had no way of knowing that the quiet man in the tweed jacket was about to change her life forever. The bell above the diner door jingled sharp against the rain, tapping the windows. Three men entered, shaking water from their coats. They didn't belong here, Everything about them was too polished, too loud for the Moonlight Diner's worn booths and chipped counters. Their shoes shone like mirrors, their suits cut close to their frames, their cologne arriving a full second before they did. They moved with the confidence of men used to being noticed, and they took the best seat in the house, the corner booth, with a clear view of the street. Clara Dawson approached with her order pad tucked in one hand, her face set in the polite mask she had perfected over 2 years of service. "Evening, gentlemen. Coffee to start." Her tone was flat neutral. The one in the center, Ryan Mercer, didn't look at her. His slicked-back blonde hair caught the light of the neon sign buzzing overhead, and on his wrist gleamed a watch that probably cost more than Clara earned in a year. He was too busy boasting to the other two, Cole Whitman, thin, sharp-nosed with a tie the color of a stop sign, and Derek Sloan, broader, heavier, but just as smug. And that's when I told them Ryan was saying his voice loud enough for the whole diner to hear, "We don't invest in ideas, we invest in disruptors." Finch's architecture isn't just an improvement, it's an extinction event. Cole laughed, a short barking sound. "You're a killer, Ryan. The board must be thrilled." At the name, Clara's step faltered. Finch. Her throat tightened, and the coffee pot in her hand trembled. The words struck her like stones. Dr. Alistair Finch, her mentor, the man who had once called her a prodigy. He had stolen her life's work and published it as his own. The betrayal had driven her out of academia straight into this diner with its cracked vinyl and greasy griddles. She steadied the pot and forced herself to keep moving. Ryan finally deigned to look at her. His smirk curled, practiced cruel. "Just coffee for now, sweetheart. Black. And quick, we're celebrating a seed round worth more than this whole block of Boston." Heat flushed up Clara's neck. "Sweetheart." The word landed like a slap. She poured hands tight around the handle. A splash of boiling liquid sloshed over, scalding her wrist. She bit her lip, refusing to cry out. Cole noticed and chuckled. "Careful there. Don't damage the merchandise." His eyes weren't on the coffee pot. Derek leaned back in the booth, arms stretched wide. "What's the biggest decision you made today, sweetheart? Who gets the last slice of pie?" The three of them burst into laughter, their voices echoing off the tiled walls. The sound filled the diner, drowning out the soft clatter from the kitchen. Clara stood still, the pot shaking in her grip, her pulse pounding in her ears. She wanted to scream to tell them she had once solved equations that kept seasoned physicists awake at night. Equations that Finch had stolen and turned into his empire. But screaming wouldn't pay Ethan's medical bills. Rage wouldn't keep him alive. So she swallowed it down. She lowered her gaze, tucked the pot against her hip, and turned away in silence. Their laughter followed her, sharp and cruel. At the far end of the diner, the old man in the tweed jacket lowered his newspaper just enough to watch. His pale blue eyes tracked every detail, the tightening of Clara's jaw, the way her shoulders hunched under the weight of humiliation, the fire buried, but not extinguished, behind her silence. Jonathan Cross had seen arrogance before. He had built an empire out of watching men like Ryan Mercer overestimate themselves. But tonight, in this run-down diner, what caught his attention was not the swagger of youth in expensive suits. It was the quiet, battered dignity of a young woman forced to bear their cruelty in silence. And Jonathan Cross was not a man who could watch forever. The laughter in the diner rose to a cruel pitch, echoing off tile and chrome, until another sound broke through a quiet but deliberate rustle of paper. The old man in the corner folded his newspaper, smoothing its creases with patient hands. He laid it down beside his half-empty cup of tea, pushed his glasses higher on the bridge of his nose, and slowly stood. For a moment, no one paid him any attention. To most, he looked like a relic of another age. Silver hair, neatly combed tweed jacket, patched at the elbows shoes that had seen better decades. He might have been a retired teacher or widower, passing the time in the comfort of routine. certainly not someone who could command a room. But when Jonathan Cross straightened his shoulders and stepped forward, the atmosphere shifted. The hum of the fluorescent lights seemed to fade. The rain tapping at the windows fell into rhythm with his measured steps. By the time he stopped at the edge of the corner booth, even Ryan Mercer's voice trailed off. "Can we help you, old-timer Ryan?" Smirked, leaning back with studied arrogance. His tone was dismissive, but there was a flicker of unease in his eyes. Jonathan did not answer him. He turned instead, looking past the suits, his pale blue gaze settling on Clara Dawson, who stood frozen a few feet away, clutching the coffee pot to her chest like a shield. Something in that gaze made her draw in a shaky breath. He wasn't looking at her apron or her crooked name tag or the stain on her sleeve. He was looking at her. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, yet carried through the diner with the clarity of a bell. It was not the voice of a frail old man. It was the voice of someone used to being heard. "Gentlemen," Jonathan said, his tone calm, almost polite. "I couldn't help but overhear your celebration. You say you invest in the future, that you fund disruption." Ryan's smirk widened. "That's right. Vidian Ventures. We make the future." "The future." Jonathan repeated the word softly with a hint of sadness. He let the silence linger until the men shifted uncomfortably under his gaze. Then his eyes sharpened, and his voice hardened just slightly. A mind truly capable of shaping the future must be able to wrestle with complexity, with the unknown. Allow me to offer a hypothetical. The diner held its breath. Jonathan's hands rested lightly on the edge of the booth as he began his words, weaving a web of ideas that left the suits blinking in confusion. Imagine he set a closed quantum system modeled after a black hole's event horizon. Hawking radiation appears to strip information, violating the very principle of unitarity. Yet according to the no-hiding theorem, information cannot vanish completely. So tell me, how would you resolve the paradox? How would you use the geometry of 11 hidden dimensions, compactified into Calabi-Yau manifolds, to retrieve the information without breaking the laws of physics? The question hung in the air like a thunderclap. Ryan opened his mouth and then closed it again. Cole frowned, his brow furrowed as if he could bluff his way through, but the words refused to come. Derek shifted in his seat, glancing around for rescue that wasn't coming. Their world was one of valuations and burn rates, not black holes and manifolds. The language Jonathan spoke might as well have been Martian. But to Clara Dawson, the words struck like lightning. Her pulse quickened. Her mind, dulled by years of exhaustion, lit up as if someone had thrown open the shutters of a darkened room. This wasn't random jargon. It wasn't nonsense. It was hers, her theory. The work Finch had stolen. The nights she had spent hunched over notebooks filled with elegant diagrams, whispering possibilities into the silence. The ghosts in the manifold. She gripped the coffee pot tighter to steady herself. For the first time in years, Clara felt the old fire in her chest flicker back to life. And Jonathan Cross, watching her closely, saw it too. For a heartbeat, Clara Dawson stood frozen. The old man's question hung in the air like thunder rattling the fragile walls she had built around herself. Her fingers tightened on the coffee pot until her knuckles went white. She wanted to look away, to retreat back into the safety of silence. But her eyes fell on the table before her, the salt and pepper shakers sitting side by side. She reached for them slowly, as if in a trance. The salt became the black hole. The pepper, a particle of Hawking radiation. Her hands moved almost on their own, sketching invisible arcs in the air between them. At first, her voice was hesitant, rusty from years of disuse. "You're postulating a variation of the firewall paradox," she murmured. "The conflict between general relativity and quantum unitarity." But she inhaled sharply, her mind snapping into focus. But the mistake is always treating the extra dimensions as static. They're not. They're dynamic. They ripple. Her words quickened her tone, gaining strength. The information isn't gone. It's translated. The Calabi-Yau manifolds aren't silent, they vibrate. They echo. The data is preserved in the higher dimensional fluctuations. If you had a detector sensitive enough to read the ripples, you could reconstruct the lost qubits. Not from the radiation itself, that's noise. From the resonance of the manifold. Her hands danced in the air, as though she still held chalk before a blackboard. She drew unseen diagrams, her movements sharp and precise. Equations poured from her lips like poetry, each line building on the last. The diner had gone silent. Forks hung in mid-air conversations, forgotten. Sam, the cook behind the counter, leaned forward, spatula frozen in his hand. Mrs. Gable, the elderly woman in the corner booth, peered over her glasses, her mouth open in astonishment. The three investors sat paralyzed. Ryan Mercer's smug expression drained away, leaving only pale confusion. Cole Whitman looked down at his phone as though desperate for a screen to save him. Derek Sloan shifted uncomfortably, his bravado crumbling. But Clara didn't see them. She wasn't in the Moonlight Diner anymore. In her mind, she was back at MIT, standing before a blackboard filled with chalk dust and elegant symbols. She was the young woman with fire in her eyes, the one who had stared into the mysteries of the universe and dared to believe she could solve them. Her chest rose and fell with the rhythm of revelation. For the first time in years, she wasn't simply surviving, she was alive. And then came the voice. Gentle, reverent, awestruck. Incredible. Clara stopped. The salt shaker slipped from her hand and clattered softly against the table. She turned, her breath catching. Jonathan Cross stood before her, his pale blue eyes alight with recognition. The faintest smile curved across his weathered face, the kind of smile that came not from politeness, but from discovery. "That's the missing piece," he said softly, almost to himself. "The dynamic manifold. My team has been blind to it for a year." Slowly, he extended his hand toward her. His palm was steady, his voice rich with conviction. "My name is Jonathan Cross, and I have been searching for a mind like yours for a very long time." The diner remained utterly silent. The three suits shrank into their booth, but every other eye in the room was on Clara, the waitress who had just spoken like a physicist, the tired young woman who suddenly looked like she carried the stars in her hands. Clara's heart pounded. She glanced down at her apron, stained with grease and coffee, then back at the hand outstretched before her. For the first time in years, the walls of doubt around her cracked, and in the quiet hum of the moonlight, diner hope slipped through. The silence in the diner broke when Jonathan Cross finally turned to the three suits. His voice was calm, but it carried the weight of command. "I believe you gentlemen were finished here." It wasn't a question. Ryan Mercer sputtered, his cheeks blotched red, but the force of Jonathan's gaze froze the words in his throat. Cole scrambled for his coat, nearly knocking over his coffee cup. Derek muttered something under his breath that no one caught. Within seconds, the three of them were gone, their polished shoes slapping against the wet pavement outside, their laughter replaced by the hiss of rain. They vanished into the night like chastised schoolboys, not the titans of finance they fancied themselves to be. Jonathan turned back to Clara. "Sit," he said gently. Her knees nearly buckled as she slid into the cracked vinyl booth across from him. Her hands trembled so hard she had to set the coffee pot down before it slipped from her grasp. For a long moment, neither spoke. The hum of the refrigerator filled the silence. Then the words tumbled out of her. She told him everything the nights at MIT when her notebooks filled with ideas too wild for her peers to follow. The way Finch had smiled at her theories, encouraged her to keep writing, then taken it all and claimed it as his own. The day she saw his name on a paper that should have been hers. The endless rejection letters the doors slammed in her face. And finally, the cruelest cut of all, her brother Ethan's diagnosis, the reason she had walked away from academia altogether. Her voice cracked when she spoke his name. I couldn't let him go without a fight. So I came here. Every plate, every tip, every hour on my feet, it was all for Ethan. Jonathan listened without interruption. His eyes never left hers, and though his expression remained controlled, a shadow passed over his face at the mention of Finch. When she finished, Clara lowered her gaze, ashamed of the tears sliding down her cheeks. For a long time, Jonathan said nothing. Then softly, Alistair Finch built his reputation on theft. But a thief can only carry another's torch so far. What you showed tonight, that wasn't Finch's work. That was yours. Clara shook her head. It doesn't matter. I can't go back. That door is closed. Jonathan leaned forward, folding his weathered hands on the table. Miss Dawson, doors do not close forever. Sometimes it only takes the right key. Her breath caught. I will not offer you a job. He continued, his voice steady, resonant. Jobs are for those who follow orders. What I offer is a partnership. I will build you an institute, your name on the door, your vision at its heart. I will fund the labs, gather the finest minds, and give you every resource to finish what you began. And while you do, your brother will have the best care this country can provide. No more nights alone with bills and broken dreams. Only the work and the chance to make it whole again. Clara's heart pounded so loud, she feared he could hear it. For years she had carried her dream like a locked door inside her chest, one she dared not try again for fear of it staying shut. And here, in a greasy diner on a rain-slicked night, a stranger was offering her the key. Tears welled in her eyes, but this time they weren't from shame. They were from the sudden, terrifying possibility of hope. The next morning, Clara pushed open the door to the Moonlight Diner one last time. The neon buzzed overhead, the smell of bacon grease thick as ever. Sam, the gruff old cook, stood at the grill flipping pancakes. He looked up as she approached, and without a word wiped his hands on his apron. From his pocket he pulled a crumpled envelope and pressed it into her palm. It was thick with cash. From me and the rest of the crew, he muttered, refusing to meet her eyes. His voice softened just for a moment. We always knew you were more than this place. Clara swallowed hard, fighting the lump in her throat. She glanced around the booths, the counter, the old jukebox silent in the corner. This diner had been her prison, but also her shelter. Now at last, it was behind her. She walked out the door, the bell chiming overhead. The rain had stopped. The city smelled new. And for the first time in years, so did her future. The months that followed felt like a dream moving at double speed. For Clara Dawson, the world she had thought lost, forever, bloomed open before her eyes. Her first victory wasn't in the lab, it was with Ethan. Cross's people moved quickly, arranging consultations with specialists whose names Clara had only read about in medical journals. Ethan was transferred to a private medical center that felt more like a university campus than a hospital. His new room had a wide window overlooking a garden, sunlight pouring in each morning. Slowly, his frail body began to show signs of recovery. Each time Clara visited, his smile grew stronger. You finally found someone who speaks your language, he whispered once, squeezing her hand. The words fueled her like oxygen. While Ethan fought his battle, another fight began on the Crosswell campus. Jonathan had kept his promise. An entire floor of the sprawling R&D complex was cleared, renovated, and christened the Dawson Institute for Quantum Dynamics. Her name gleamed on the frosted glass doors in bold black letters. Clara paused the first time she saw it, her throat tightening with pride and disbelief. Inside the space thrummed with possibility. Whiteboards stretched wall to wall, already filling with sprawling constellations of equations. High-powered servers hummed in climate-controlled rooms. Prototypes glowed under glass cases. It was a cathedral built not of stone, but of knowledge and ambition. And Clara was not alone. She began to gather others outsiders like herself. There was Dr. Ken Tanaka, a hardware engineer once dismissed for designs deemed too radical. There was Maria Flores, a brilliant but chaotic data scientist who had been shoved out of a CERN project for refusing to follow hierarchy. There was Jamal Price, a young mathematician from Chicago who had dropped out of his PhD after professors told him his ideas were too speculative. To each of them, Clara offered what Jonathan had offered her, a chance. Soon, the institute pulsed with life. Days blurred into nights. Equations spilled across glass boards, their reflections glowing like constellations in the dark. The air carried the sharp scent of burnt coffee and ozone from experimental hardware. Failures were frequent qubits, collapsing prototypes, sparking, but laughter was just as common. For the first time in years, Clara was not alone in the fight. She had a family of minds as hungry as her own, and at the heart of it all was the theory Finch had stolen. But now it was no longer a theory. Clara and her team reshaped it, expanded it, refined it. They proved what Finch had only polished on paper: the ghosts in the manifold, the dynamic ripples of higher dimensions. What once seemed like science fiction slowly became engineering. Word began to spread. Whispers at conferences, articles speculating about the mysterious project Jonathan Cross was backing. Rivals scrambled for details, but the institute was sealed tight. Clara refused to reveal anything until the work was undeniable. That day came at the Eldridge Innovation Summit, the largest stage in the tech world. Titans of industry filled the vast auditorium. Journalists, investors, scientists, and skeptics crowded into every seat. The air buzzed with anticipation. Clara stood backstage, palms damp, heart hammering. She wasn't a performer. She was a physicist who had once scrubbed counters in a diner. But then, she saw Ethan in the front row. His frame was still thin, but his eyes sparkled, and when he lifted his hand in a thumbs up, her fear steadied. She walked onto the stage. At first, the applause was polite, perfunctory. Many in the audience barely knew her name. But by the time she finished speaking, the room would never forget it. She laid out the principles with elegant clarity, the kind that silenced every doubt. She spoke of dimensions not as abstractions, but as tools. She described the resonance of hidden manifolds, the method of retrieving what once seemed lost. And then she unveiled it, the prototype. A working model of stable qubits humming softly behind reinforced glass. The crowd erupted. Applause shook the hall, rolling like thunder. Faces lit up in awe. Reporters scrambled for quotes. Investors whispered about revolutions. Clara's team, seated together, beamed with pride. But Clara looked only at Ethan. He grinned at her, his eyes wet with tears. Pride, love, triumph, all condensed into that simple look. Across the city in his office, Alistair Finch watched the live stream. The smug smile he wore when the event began had long since faded. As Clara presented his face, drained of color, his empire built on stolen brilliance was crumbling in real time. Contracts he had boasted about would now look like reckless bets. And the name Dawson, once buried in the margins of his notebooks, now lit up across headlines. On that stage, beneath the blinding lights, Clara Dawson reclaimed not only her work, but her future. And Alistair Finch began to feel the ground shift beneath his feet. In the weeks that followed the Eldridge Summit, the names Ryan Mercer, Cole Whitman, and Derek Sloan faded into background noise. Their brash laughter, once so loud in the Moonlight Diner, became nothing more than an embarrassing memory. No one quoted them in the financial papers anymore. No one looked for their opinions on the future. They had mocked a waitress without realizing she carried a universe in her mind, and in doing so had written themselves into irrelevance. Clara Dawson, once Ellie, the invisible server in a faded apron, now stood at the helm of a frontier. She was no longer the shadow in the corner booth. She was the architect of a new language in science, the leader of a team that spoke to the very bones of the cosmos. Yet even as headlines called her the new face of quantum research and journalists scrambled for interviews, Clara's greatest triumph was not the applause, not the acclaim, not even the victory over Finch. It was Ethan. She sat at his bedside one evening, the golden glow of sunset spilling across the room. He was stronger now, his voice steady, his smile no longer a fragile flicker, but a flame. He looked at her with the mischievous spark she remembered from his boyhood, the one the illness had tried to extinguish. "You finally found someone who believed in you," he whispered. Clara's throat tightened. She squeezed his hand, realizing the truth of it. Jonathan Cross had given her resources, yes, but more than that, he had given her the one thing she had been starving for: belief. And through that belief, she had found herself again. The story does not end in a lab or under the flash of cameras. It ends where it began, back at the Moonlight Diner. The neon sign hummed faintly, casting red and blue shadows across the rain-slicked sidewalk. Inside, the booths were empty, the coffee pot cleaned, and set to rest for the night. Clara paused at the window, looking in from the street. She could see her reflection layered over the old counter like two versions of herself, overlapping the weary waitress she had been and the woman she had become. Her heart swelled with memory, the sting of coffee on her wrist, the sting of laughter sharper still, and the sudden voice of a man who had asked a question no one else could answer. A question that had unlocked everything. Greatness, she realized, does not always announce itself. It does not always wear fine suits or sit at the head of a boardroom table. Sometimes it hides in plain sight behind an apron, in the quiet of a night shift, in the resilience of someone simply trying to endure. And all it takes is one moment, one chance, for that hidden light to blaze. Clara let the thought settle deep inside her. For her, the diner was no longer a cage. It was the place where she was seen, where she was asked, where she had begun again. She turned from the glass, pulling her coat tight against the evening breeze, and walked into the night. That, dear listener, is the heart of this story. That every person you overlook might carry a universe within them. That the quietest voice in the room may be the one that changes the world. And that sometimes all it takes is someone willing to ask the right question. If Clara Dawson's journey touched you, if it reminded you of the power of belief, of resilience, of brilliance hidden in unexpected places, share this story with someone who might need that reminder. And before you go, I'd like to hear from you. Tell us in the comments who in your life once surprised you with hidden brilliance. If you want more stories of resilience, of humanity, of ordinary lives turning extraordinary, subscribe to our channel. Because the next story we share might just remind you of the greatness waiting quietly around you.